When we looked back at Company of Heroes, we really loved what we had produced. We loved the game, we loved the franchise, and there's a sense of tone and pace and immersion and authenticity, and we wanted to maintain that. And so part of what we wanted to do in Company of Heroes 2 was create more authenticity and more realism for the player and more tactical gameplay. Sort of get the kind of things that we were known for, this tactical RTS, and really build upon that. And what that meant was just sort of making targeted improvements. I mean, the Company of Heroes was the highest rated RTS possibly of all time. And that's a solid benchmark for us. We didn't want to deviate too much from that. The new Essence Engine 3 really gives us a lot of flexibility, a lot of power in how we introduce new features into the game. We've got much more graphical fidelity, so the sort of immersion into the game, what we call the presentation layer, is much more, I think it's much more beautiful, I think, than the original. It surpasses the original both in fidelity and performance. And we've got new features like vaulting that allow infantry to get over cover. In the old game, you had to go all the way around if or maybe blow a hole in the wall. We did have that sort of dynamic and destructible environment, but this now allows infantry to get over the wall. We wanted to make them these sort of masters of tactical maneuverability, so they can get away from machine guns or they can get away from vehicles that might be pinning them against a wall. We also introduced True Sight, which is a much more dynamic line of sight system. And if you understand RTSs, you know that your units generally punch this perfectly circular little hole in the fog of war. But in Company of Heroes 2, it's much more dynamic, and so you can only see what your units can see, and so there's this layer of tension all of a sudden that emerges on the battlefield, because it's one of the first games, the RTS games for sure, that I've played where I've actually jumped. There's sort of, I come around the corner and there's a tank there that I couldn't see because it was hidden behind a building. And there's sort of this emergent layer, coming out of the gameplay where players are really starting to learn to take advantage of line of sight blocking for setting up weapons and machine guns and ambush type weapons, things that we couldn't do in Company of Heroes. Company of Heroes 2 is set on the Eastern Front, and you're part of the Soviet army, engaged in brutal frontline combat trying to force the Germans out of the Soviet Union. You're protecting the soil of Mother Russia. And we look back at World War II and we think about the sort of D-Day landings and the fight in Western Europe, and not to belittle it, because it was a very important event, but the vast majority of the war happened further east. The Germans lost 80% of their combat casualties on the Eastern Front, and so there's this huge epic environment of the largest battles of the 20th century were fought on the Eastern Front. I mean, we're talking battles engaged millions and millions of soldiers, and so it's something that we don't really get to experience as Western developers and as Western game players. We've got no idea of what the Eastern Front was like, and we want to be able to bring just a little bit of that to the player. The Russians like to talk about general snow. We showed the snow in this demo, and how the snow encumbers infantry units and makes them slow down. It actually forces them to take paths, like the roads and things like that, to make them move more quickly. But that also allows smart players to use that knowledge to their advantage, and being able to put mines and tripwires and things like that to ambush players using the roads. And so how the players use the environment has become very, very important. Units also leave tracks in the snow, and so I watch for what my enemy is doing. I look for whether I see vehicle tracks. Now I know he's got a tank somewhere in the world. And if I'm not ready with anti-tank, coming across those tracks for the first time can be really, really intimidating. We spent a lot of time sort of redoing our flame effects and our flame weapons from the original Company of Heroes. We're never quite satisfied with how they work. And especially on the Eastern Front, where a large number of the buildings are wood, we needed to get that right. It's really part of telling the story of the Eastern Front, part of the tone of the game. And so the way it looks, the way it sounds, the damage it causes to buildings, the fact that it'll burn them to the ground, it'll force enemies out of the buildings into my gunfire. It's a really important part of the gameplay. We've also looked at vehicles, for instance, embellishing how vehicles work, making them more imposing, bigger, more intimidating. So we've looked at our physics systems to make them more weighty and how they move around the environment, and they really feel like they weigh 30 tons now. Company of Heroes 2 is coming out in 2013 for the PC.